A portion of this video is sponsored by LastPass. Hey guys, Mike here, the Detroit Borg, with what I think is one of the best iPad values you can buy right now. This is the new resurrected iPad Air. This is the third generation of the iPad Air after a 2-year hiatus. Now essentially, this is a repurposed 10.5-inch iPad Pro. And in some ways, this is both an upgraded and downgraded version of the iPad Pro. And we'll talk about that. But first, let's get to the basics. So this retails for $499 with 64 gigs of storage. But for $649, the old price of the iPad Pro, you can upgrade to 256 gigs of storage. You can also get a cellular version, which adds another $129. So this finally fills a pretty big and obvious gap in their iPad lineup between the much cheaper $329 iPad and the very expensive, almost $800 iPad Pro. So getting to the unboxing, no knives here. They give us a little pull tab to rip off the plastic surrounding the box. Lifting up the lid and getting to the iPad, you can see the version I have here is in space gray. But before we unwrap this, let's get to the accessories. So first up is the paperwork. Now in my case, because I have a cellular version with LTE, I get a SIM ejection tool with my paperwork. I also get a quick start guide highlighting the major features, as well as a set of Apple stickers. Next up is a very familiar 12-watt power adapter. So unlike the iPad Pro, this does not make the transition to USB-C. It's still using Lightning. So anybody hoping for a full USB-C transition, that's not going to happen this year. But regardless, this iPad does support the faster charging speeds of USB 3.0. So getting to the iPad and unwrapping it, the first thing I notice right away is how much darker this space gray is. And that's because this is basically the same space gray as the newest iPad Pro. Now, if you compare this to space gray of the old iPad Pro or the current iPad 9.7-inch, you can see it's quite a bit darker. You can see that much lighter color on the old iPad Pro. Basically, it looked like silver. So I'm actually a big fan of this change. There's also a gold and silver, but those are colors we've seen before. This is the first time we're seeing this space gray on this iPad. Before I go in depth with the iPad, I just want to talk about today's sponsor, LastPass. Now, if this is your first iPad or you're replacing an old iPad, one of the first things you might want to do is install LastPass, the first app I install on all of my new devices. One of the biggest challenges of using so many different devices is just keeping all those passwords synced together. So traditionally, every time I set up a new device, I had to manually enter the passwords for all of my accounts. But with LastPass installed, it will automatically remember my password and autofill them into every app or website. And because LastPass supports multiple platforms, I can use the exact same service on iOS and Android. Because LastPass remembers everything for you, it breaks some bad habits, such as writing your passwords down in an unsecure manner, or just using the exact same password on all of your accounts. So if one of them is compromised, they could potentially take that password to all of your other accounts. Instead, LastPass can generate strong individual passwords for each account. And the only thing you have to remember is your master password for LastPass, which you can also secure behind multi-factor authentication. So if you guys want to check out LastPass, I highly recommend it, and you'll find a link in the description below. Thanks to LastPass for sponsoring this part of the video, and let's move on to the iPad. Taking a closer look at the design, a few things you might notice here is that the chamfers or the machined surfaces are now matte, so they have the same anodized finish as the rest of the chassis. So presumably that reduces cost, but it also makes this darker space gray possible. So as before, we have the volume controls and the sleep-wake power button right around the camera module. Toward the center, we have our dual microphones, and because I have the cellular model, you'll see these antenna stripes around the top edge. So if you had the Wi-Fi model, you wouldn't see this small antenna strip at all. Those dual microphones also work with the M12 motion coprocessor for the Siri wake-up command, so you can remotely command Siri hands-free whether the iPad is plugged into power or not. Of course, we also have Touch IDs, so Face ID still remains the iPhone and iPad Pro exclusive. Another quiet update for this iPad is eSIM support. So if you get a version with cellular, you'll see a SIM tray, but you may not have a SIM in that tray at all. And that's because we have built-in eSIM support, so you can sign on with any carrier that supports the electronic SIM, and that's most of them in the US. And although we don't have speakers at the top edge, we do have them at the bottom edge, again with darker grills to match the darker space gray. Same with the insert for the Lightning connector. And I think the biggest selling point for the iPad, and one of the reasons this is such a good value, is the 10.5-inch display largely carried over from the iPad Pro. So we get the same specs here, 2224 by 1668, good for 264 pixels per inch or a Retina resolution. This is a P3 display, so it supports the same wide color gamut as the Pros. This is also a True Tone display, so it automatically adapts the color temperature or the white balance of the display to the ambient lighting in the room. And more importantly, compared to the 9.7-inch iPad, this display is fully laminated to the glass, so there is no air gap between the display and the glass. The only thing missing from the iPad Pro is the ProMotion technology. So that's a 120 Hz refresh rate. Instead, we have a conventional 60 Hz refresh rate. I don't think that's a big deal. Of course, you save a lot of money by going this route instead of going for the iPad Pro. But you still get most of the benefits of the iPad Pro display that used to cost a lot more. Also carried over from the iPad Pro is support for two accessories, the first generation Apple Pencil and the Smart Keyboard. So although this isn't the cheapest iPad with Apple Pencil support, it is the cheapest iPad and the cheapest Apple device with a physical keyboard, which I think is another big selling point. But of course, that's an extra expense that you have to purchase. But this iPad is perfectly sized for a full keyboard. Now, this keyboard works with a smart connector on the edge of the iPad. So that provides direct electrical connection to the iPad without the need for a battery or Bluetooth. And it folds up really compactly and is easy to carry around. Now, I mentioned this is both an upgraded and downgraded version of the iPad Pro. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. For the most part, the CPU is the only upgrade here. So we go from an A10 to an A12. So that's a significant performance improvement. So that means this iPad is much more future-proof. So this should support iOS releases far beyond what the iPad Pro 10.5-inch would. And there's a few other improvements, including some of the radios, which gives us Bluetooth 5.0, replacing 4.2 from the old iPad Pro. And although we get an upgraded CPU, we do downgrade from 4 gigs to 3 gigs of RAM. Again, not something I think most people are going to notice, especially without ProMotion, so I don't think this is a big loss. We also lose the quad speakers, which had 2 speakers on the top and bottom or left and right side, depending on how you look at it, and unfortunately that means audio is annoyingly lopsided when you're using this in landscape orientation. The camera system has also been downgraded, so we lose the LED flash, and we also go from a 12 megapixel camera to 8 megapixels with a 5-element instead of 6-element lens, and we lose optical image stabilization. This also means we lose 4K video recording. The best we can do is 1080p HD video, but we do get slow motion up to 240 frames per second. The FaceTime HD camera was not downgraded, however. It's still 7 megapixels with 1080p HD video. Now, I think the camera on the back of an iPad is fairly low priority, so I don't think it's a big loss to have a lesser camera on this iPad compared to the iPad Pro, especially if you're saving some money. But even that, it's still a pretty decent camera as well, especially with the new A12 image signal processor, so it's able to deliver pretty solid images anyway. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, and because I couldn't resolve this before I made this video, there are some manufacturing defects on my iPad Air. So if you look around the antenna stripes, there are dimples on either side. I didn't do this. This came out of the box like this. I will take it back to Apple and hopefully get it resolved. If not, I'll make sure to let you know. Although the baseline iPad is a great value at $329, you can often get it much cheaper than that. It's hard to ignore the fact that it looks and feels like a much older piece of hardware. It's also running an older chip. It doesn't have the vibrant DCI-P3 or True Tone display technology of the iPad Air. And again, it's not laminated to the glass, so it definitely looks lower grade. Now, in many ways, I think this iPad Air is the first time we finally get a device that is worth upgrading to, especially if you're using any iPad with a 9.7-inch screen. When they dropped the iPad Air for the current iPad, it really was sort of a retrograde update. Nice processor, but the hardware kind of took a step back, so it became a very unappealing update. But with the iPad Air 3, we finally get an update that makes sense for previous customers. So it's nice to have something that slots between the boring baseline iPad and the overly expensive iPad Pro. The iPad Pro does use a different A12 chip than the iPad Air. It's called an A12X, and it has 8 cores instead of 6 cores on the CPU and 7 cores versus 4 cores on the GPU. So you're still going to see very different performance, but the thing to keep in mind is that the OS is basically identical on both of them. Now, the reason I think this is the best iPad value is that you get everything you need and nothing you don't. So you don't have to pay for the things you don't really need, but you get all of the right priorities. You get a fantastic large display with the latest processor and a nice compact bezel with a screen that's just large enough for a full-size keyboard. And at £1, it happens to be the lightest iPad you can buy. So in the end, I really like the iPad Air. It's just the right amount of hardware for the OS. I think the iPad Pro is really pushing the OS with that extravagant hardware, and I think the baseline iPad is just overdue for a major update. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed this look at the new iPad Air. If you did, please give this video a like to let me know, and I'll see you again in my next video.